to our book talk this evening hosted by Merrill College of Journalism. I am Katie Arnie. I'm the Assistant Dean for External Relations, and I'm just going to make a couple housekeeping announcements before we get things started here. First of all, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I hope you and your loved ones are safe and healthy wherever you are during this unusual time. Just a couple notes, everybody should be muted upon entry with video off, and so we just ask for the most part that you stay that way. We do encourage you to submit questions using the chat box. So if you do have questions at any point, go ahead and submit those at any time, and we'll get to those throughout the discussion. We are recording this, and it will be posted to the college's YouTube channel afterwards. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention, if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to visit keeptogether.umd.edu. It's a sort of a one-stop shop that the university has set up that is full of resources and updates on how the university is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as lists of all sorts of virtual events and programming like this, and also information on how you can help support our students at this time. So I encourage you to check that out. And now I would like to turn things over to Dean Lucy Dalglish, the Dean of Merrill College of Journalism, and she will introduce our special guest for this evening, Peter Mehlman, to talk about his new book as well. So we'll turn it over to Dean Dalglish. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. I hope everyone is doing well and that your families and friends are healthy and happy and not going too crazy. It's been obviously an unusual time for us at Merrill College, but we're doing pretty well with online learning. And we know that a lot of you are our alums. So thank you so much for coming in, signing in to listen to our discussion with one of our favorite alums, Peter Mehlman. And this is not where we thought we were going to be talking to Peter, but we thought we were going to be doing it on March 31st, but he's very graciously agreed to do it tonight. So coming to us from his house in Santa Monica, Peter Mehlman. And to give you a little, those of you who do not know him, just let you know that Peter is originally from New York. He moved to Maryland to go to college. He graduated in 1977, probably with some of you, and he worked on the Diamondback while he was there. And one of his first jobs was to work at the Washington Post for George Solomon on the sports desk. He made a move from print journalism to television writing when, from 1982 to 1984, he wrote for and produced the television series Sports Beat with Howard Cosell. And for the next 5 years, he returned to freelance magazine writing in New York for magazines such as the New York Times Magazine, GQ, and Esquire. Then in the late 80s, he moved to Los Angeles and was offered the opportunity to write a script for Seinfeld by University of Maryland alum Larry David. Jerry Seinfeld was so impressed that he gave Peter a writing assignment, out of which became the series' very first freelance episode called The Apartment. Peter was hired for the first full season of Seinfeld as a program consultant, and over the next 6 years worked his way up to co-executive producer in the show's last season after Larry David's departure. And after Seinfeld wound down, he created, produced, and co-wrote the sitcom It's Like, You Know, which was primarily a bitter satire of life in Los Angeles and Hollywood regarding the notables and the rich. Peter is an artist. Those of you who have the hardcover version of his book, he did the illustration for the cover. He is a journalist, a show producer, a filmmaker, a creative writer, and a novelist. And a couple of years ago, he visited Merrill College to talk about his first novel, It Won't Always Be This Great. Peter is a great friend of Merrill College. He contributed an endowed scholarship to our students several years ago. He hosted a gathering for all Los Angeles-based Maryland alumni last summer at his home in Santa Monica. And he was planning to sponsor a table for Merrill College students at George Solomon's retirement dinner on April 1, which, as you know, was canceled because of the coronavirus. But we'll get back to that, get you information. We're going to have a virtual event in honor of George. So we had planned to have this book talk while Peter was in town for George Fest, but we're delighted that he's able to talk to us virtually tonight. So tonight we're talking about his second book, Me as Well, a novel. So let me read to you the publisher's description of the book, because I tried to describe this book and I couldn't do it nearly as well as the publisher's description. Arnie Pepper is having the worst day of his life. The Pulitzer Prize-winning sports columnist for the Washington Post has lived a thrilling, prestigious, and mostly blameless existence over nearly 4 decades of rubbing shoulders with athletic royalty at all the most prestigious sporting events of our times. Then one day, within the confines of an impromptu gathering of fellow reporters, he tosses out a characteristic one-liner about a basketball player and a hysterectomy. Overheard and subsequently posted on social media, his joke goes viral. The ensuing hurricane of condemnation threatens to take his job and reputation, alienate his daughter, and decimate his obsessively observed inner world. So, this book takes place in Washington, D.C. and Maryland. There is a collection of very interesting characters, including the 20-something biracial daughter the widowed Arnie raised solo from the time she was a toddler. Daughter Thea has grown up to be a reporter for NPR, and he adores her. Throughout the entire book, it's obvious the person whose thoughts he cares about the most are his daughters. His best friend, Jillian Corbin, is the Montgomery County prosecutor. Jillian's name used to be Jerry before she transitioned. So Arnie considers himself talented, astute, open-minded, supportive of women athletes and journalists, and liberal. In fact, on page 27 of the Kindle version, he says, "I stand out as a paragon of what a male sports writer should be." And then his world starts to crumble because of a bad joke. So, long windup. But Peter, let's start with this. You have lived in Los Angeles now for about 30 years. There's quite a collection of Washington and Maryland characters in the book. Bob Woodward, Tony Kornheiser, Phil Rucker, Ashley Parker, Sally Jenkins, Juan Dixon, Mike Wilbon, and of course, Maury Povich, Tim Kirkjung, and Les Moonves make appearances as well. Why did you make Arnie the world's greatest sports writer from the Washington Post?
Mainly because A, I know something about the Washington Post. It wouldn't require me to, do that much research. In fact, the last time I was at Maryland when I was promoting the other book, I had written a piece for the Washington Post, and the editor at the style section that I worked with, and I got along so well that I went up to the new Post building, which was kind of weird. They moved from 15th Street to, I guess, 13th and K.
Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it?
It's spectacular and technologically unbelievable. So I was really fascinated in seeing the new offices. So I had that already in my pocket, and I just love the Washington Post in general, and I think they've been doing such an incredible job during the Trump administration that, I wanted to give them kind of a little round of applause in a subtle way. And, when you watch MSNBC, you get to the point where you feel like, Phil Rucker is like a friend of yours.
I was wondering whether or not you'd met Phil Rucker. There are a whole bunch of characters from the Post that make appearances.
I met Phil Rucker for a second by coincidence when I was up there. And I had once posted something on his Facebook page, and he, just complimenting him on his great work. And, he responded by, thanking me and, stay tuned. So that was about the extent of our communication.
Yes, well, Arnie turns over a fantastic political tip to Phil Rucker. So there's all sorts of politics and sports going on in the book. I would not have been surprised to hear the tasteless joke Arnie told in the newsroom where I worked in the 1980s and 1990s. I doubt I would hear that same joke today. But the book is set in 2018, which is post-Trump election, post-Weinstein, post-Charlie Rose and Roger Ailes, when all the Me Too stuff was going on in New York, in Washington, in the New York Times, and the Ronan Farrow book and article, and when they took down Weinstein, did you think to yourself, I have to write a novel about this? How did the book come about?
No, I didn't think that. The book came about like in sections. To tell you the truth, it originally started when I read an obituary of the writer Philip Roth.
Really?
And, yeah, and I was reading about, he had written Portnoy's Complaint, in which he was incredibly obsessive about. He would go on obsessive rants about his mother and growing up. And I started thinking, like, what is it that I could get that obsessed about? And I kind of shrugged. I guess sports is the thing that, so gets on my nerves. There's so much about sports that I find kind of, I'm a big sports person, but I find a lot of it objectionable and hypocritical. And so, I thought I could go on rants with that. And then somehow I started thinking of some of the other things that consumed me at the time. And in the Me Too movement, when it was at its peak, I remember thinking, like, what is it like for Charlie Rose just to walk down the street? Or does he just stay home? Does he even, does Louis C.K. even go to get to his dental hygienist anymore? Can Matt Lauer go out to lunch with his daughter? Which is kind of, that's the kind of thing that, spawned The Daughter, because I was just fascinated by the day-to-day life of these people that are caught up in these hurricanes of horrible publicity. And then the other thing is, I have a little bit of a comedy background, so the fact that he makes a joke and gets in that much trouble was kind of fascinating to me. Like, I'm always wondering about what the line is. People always say, oh no, too soon for jokes, things like that. I don't know when humor became so dangerous, but,
Well, maybe not too soon, maybe it's too late.
Yeah, I guess, but, if there's one thing of a philosophy that I got from Seinfeld, it's that if it's funny, it's okay. Which is a dangerous way to think these days, but that's the way it was in the 90s. We made some pretty tasteless jokes there, which I thought were hysterical, but now they probably would be, there'd be outrage.
Yeah, I think you're right. So the narrative, as you said, of the book is interspersed with italicized text where you get this obsessive view of what's going on in Arnie's inner world. And at some points you're going, oh my God, what an exhausting brain this man has, how brilliant he is, which I think is a reflection of how brilliant you are. But after
he's much smarter than me.
But after being startled at this joke that he told, hanging around with a bunch of athletes and sports writers that goes viral, he worries mostly about what his kid thinks, and ultimately whether or not Marty Baron's going to fire him. So you were talking about Matt Lauer and other people who have kids. There's a scene in this where Arnie is standing outside a sushi bar and he runs into Les Moonves. And this is after Charlie Rose, after Weinstein, after Lauer, but before Moonves had his
Right.
issues. And Arnie they start talking about the problems that Arnie has. And of course, Moonves probably knows what's coming down, but Arnie doesn't. How did you come up with that scene?
I don't know. I think it, first of all, it just seemed like a funny scene because the audience, the reader knows what's going on, but Arnie doesn't. So that's kind of a funny dynamic. And on top of that, I don't really like Les Moonves very much. So I thought that I thought that it would be kind of cool to, put him in a little uncomfortable spot.
Yeah, well, I think you did that. So, when
I didn't send him a book.
You didn't?
No, I was going to send him one, but
Yeah.
He's probably busy.
Probably. When his world is going in the dumper, friends reach out and he realizes that a lot of them are trying to support him. But his women friends are clearly supporting him as a person, but not giving him a break on what it was that he said. Right. Including an interesting email on page 77 from one of Arnie's friends, one Lucy Dalglish, Dean of the Merrill College of Journalism, where he works as an adjunct sports reporting teacher. And she says, guest journalism, like society, never stops evolving. Thinking of you. I have to say I burst out laughing and had to run in the other room and show my husband that when I came across that one. But after these women, weigh in, Arnie observes, the idea creeps in that he deserves the criticism he's getting. And then a life of making sure no one ever thought of him as a bad journalist has been hijacked by the possibility of being a bad human being. But at what point do you think most people in this situation, does that dawn on most of the individuals who are in situations like this?
Yeah, I think that everybody who's been in that situation, they go, oh God, I'm going to be in for, some rough times, and they never anticipate an eighth of what they're going to be getting into. So, it's got to be just an unbelievable blizzard of just, approbation, and, what's coming your way is just so devastating. You're not only just a bad executive or a bad, or kind of like a bad boss or something like that. You are a horrible, horrible human being. That's the only answer that you're getting. And in Arnie's case, he's perceptive enough to notice that all the women who have contacted him, including you, are very delicate in their wording of what they're saying to him. And, all he can tell, there's a big difference between the bromides that he's getting from his male friends and the very, very careful, measures of support he's getting from women. And he's smart enough to observe that and realize that, oh my God, I could look really bad. This could be, much worse than I thought it would be. Because in a situation like that, he's like probably thinking, oh, I just made a joke, it'll blow over. And then, there are different stages to it deepening and deepening and deepening how bad it is, and what your crime is, and and especially in 2018, Well,
were you at all, did you take a pause? I mean, when I saw what the name of the book was and what the subject was, I thought, oh, this will be interesting. I mean, was you were writing it, were you trying to walk a really difficult line and not offend anyone, because as you said, you ask that Arnie says in the question, how did Americans get so hard to shock but so easy to offend?
Oh, I'm so glad you pointed that line out, because I think that's the overriding philosophy of the book in a way, that America is, everybody is sitting at home just typing on keyboards looking for somewhere that they can be offended. It's just amazing to me that people just want to be offended these days, because they all have a pedestal on which they could just jump up and you know, and express their opinion. And it's just shocking to me that, you know, everybody is just so thin-skinned, and yet you can't shock anybody. You know, I kind of as a hobby do stand-up, and you know, the other comedians, they're always trying to shock the audience, and it never really happens. There's nothing you can say to a comedy audience in a club that shocks anybody. And yet, if you post like the most mild opinion on Twitter, you know, you can get 1,000 responses that are just unbelievably angry.
Yeah. And the world of social media has obviously jarred Arnie, so that he probably didn't quite understand what social media was until this happened.
Yeah.
Think he was out there tweeting before this himself, or do you think he was kind of an old school writer?
I think he's an old school writer, but he probably had to tweet. I mean, I'm sure that there's some kind of, you know, dictate from above that, you know, you're supposed to publicize your articles and things like that, because, you know, obviously nobody knows more than you that the newspaper business has been suffering. And, you know, so you have to do some touting of, especially if you write a good article, you know, you want to get it out there and get as many likes or whatever as possible. You know, you want to get people on that website. So, so yeah, he hates tweeting. You know, I mean, what kind of journalist, you know, can state anything in 280 words? You know, most journalists can't do a lead that's only 280 words these days.
So there, I just kept writing down these little comments that are interspersed. I just want to read several of them. One of them is an observation that giving people a break has become un-American. But toward the end, there's also an observation about Americans that, you know, kind of gave me a little bit of hope. It said, we Americans suffer for a minute and then we get to work. I hope that's true.
Yeah, that is a very that's a very optimistic point of view, and I would have to say that's much more Arnie than it is me. But I hope it's true.
Well, you know, it's obvious from reading the book that you love sports, and your brain is like an encyclopedia of sports trivia and knowledge about professional athletes in particular, going back decades. But there are also many political observations in the book. And why did you frame what you wanted to say as a novelist, following up on what you said earlier? Why did you frame it through the lens of sports? What is it about sports that kind of allows you to make commentary about the world we live in?
I think one of the most frustrating things about sports for me is that the sports fan looks at sports as Camelot, like it's not part of the real world. You know, like everything is so confusing and angry and explosive out in the real world. They're just sitting there on their couch and going, oh, please just give me my game so I can turn my brain off and watch the game. And, you know, I'm just opposed to that. I think people have got to realize that sports is as much a part of the real world as business or politics or anything. You know, this is big business, and there's a lot of greed out there. You know, the motives for the, you know, for the NCAA and for the NFL, you know, just is unbelievable. These are organizations just completely driven by money. And you know, and the different leagues represent different parts of society too, in a way, because like the NBA is like the left wing, you know, and they're always way out ahead. You know, the NBA, if it had to relocate, would be in California, the whole organization, because they're out ahead of everything. And you know, the NFL is big business. It's just all, you know, now they're upping the season to 17 games. And, you know, when I went to Maryland, if the Terps got into a bowl game, that means they would play 11 games that season. Now, if you get to be in a bowl game, you could play, 13 or 14 games. I mean, these kids, they never get a minute to just be a college student. You know, the exchange is supposed to be, I'll play this sport and you're going to give me an education and give me a chance to be a college student. You know, I mean, things like spring football, you know, just drives me crazy that these kids, you know, who show up in the middle of the summer to start working out, then they play football till January, and then they get 2 little months, you know, January and February, which are not the greatest months in Maryland and Washington, let's face it, you know. And then they're back at it playing football in March, you know, for 4 weeks. And you know, and the coaches really, it's like, well, if he gets hurt, he's got all summer to recover. So, and you know, that kind of stuff just drives me crazy about sports. As you can see, I'm just obsessing about all this stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's move a little bit before we take some questions. And I would encourage anyone who has a question. Katie Auntie is monitoring the chat, and we're going to go to chat questions shortly. And then also I will be looking at the participant list, and if anybody would prefer to raise their hand, I'm trying to see whether or not, you know, that's not an option here. But if you would like to click on the word yes, I will assume that you would like to ask a verbal question. But please type in any questions you have into the chat icon. Just click on the icon at the bottom of your screen and type away. But let's talk for a minute about Arnie's daughter, Thea, who, she's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I love Thea.
Thea is pretty awesome. In the end, you know, she obviously adores him. He adores her. He's done a fantastic job of raising this young lady to love sports, but also be out there and be, you know, worldly and be successful enough to work for NPR. And she's, you know, concerned about him and everything, but ultimately at the end of the book, she loves him and everything, but she lets him have it when she thinks he doesn't appreciate the seriousness of the moment that we're in. And that he probably deserves, I thought, the punishment that Marty Barron and the editors on the Post impose upon him, but she also seems to forgive him. What or who does Thea represent, do you think?
Thea represents, in a way, the present. You know, whereas Arnie is the past, she's the present. She's the person, even though she says, I don't even know the rules, that they're changing every day, but she's as close to knowing the rules and what's going on and close to being current as anyone can possibly be. And, you know, she's kind of the conscience of the book. Mm-hmm. And, you know, she's the only person ultimately whose opinion matters. Mm-hmm. So, you know, eventually he's got to get down to what's really on her mind. You know, sometimes he's poking around in the book trying to figure out where she is on this. And sometimes his emotions start running away with him, his imagination that she wants nothing to do with him if he hasn't heard from her for a few hours. So ultimately, I thought it was important that he gets her full he gets her full opinion right in his face.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to open it up to questions if anyone has one. And as we've done in the past when Peter's been in the building, you don't have to limit yourself to the book. You can ask about his experiences at Maryland. I think he had a pretty good time. And or Seinfeld or anything else, or if there are any aspiring stand-up comedians out there, you might want to ask him for advice on how to get involved in that. So Katie, do we have anyone? I can't see them.
Yeah, so actually somebody sent me a question. Peter, did you think at all about Michael Richards when writing the book, considering that Richards was subject to the cancel culture 14 years ago before there was a cancel culture?
Interesting question. Yes, it came into my mind. And, of course, I didn't really want to deal with that because, because they're going to know that the writer of the book was a Seinfeld person. And I think it would, kind of take the reader out of the book. But I've had, a lot of mixed thoughts about that, and my conclusion was that, Michael, I never thought of in a million years that there's any bit of racism in him. And yet, he said what he said, and it's a very dicey issue, even though I didn't, my feeling was that he was trying to be provocative and he went about it in a horribly wrong way. And I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, and yet, I kind of have to agree with, Chris Rock, who said basically after that happened, people keep saying, "Oh, is Michael Richards a racist?" And Chris said, "Well, I mean, he was yelling out the N-word in a crowded room. What do you have to do to be called a racist now? Shoot Medgar Evers?" And that's kind of a funny but it's a great line, but you can't argue with that.
Yeah.
Kind of a tragic situation.
Yeah.
So we have another question from Kathy, who says, many top sports writers now see their roles as commentators and not just reporters. Do you think that contributed to Arnie's bad judgment?
Well, sports writing has always had a lot more leeway for opinions than news has, even, on straight reporting as opposed to columnists. But I do think it's gone a little bit over the top. And I think that sports writers are notoriously free with their opinions. And, he said this he made this bad joke amongst a bunch of other sports writers. And, that's supposed to be kind of like the sanctity of the press box, excuse me. But, it got out. And so I think the fact of that sports writing has gotten to the point where like everybody can express their opinion ended up clashing in the book with 2018, where expressing your opinion could ultimately became almost lethal.
Have you ever had a situation, there's a line in the book where it's like, if I could just have one, I'm looking for it here. I just want to go back one day. You ever had a time in your life you could say to yourself, if I could just go back one day?
Yes, every day. Yeah. I've never had a day where I didn't, have some regret that I'd like to go back and undo. I mean, nothing on the level of Arnie. And I mean, the closest that I ever came to Arnie's situation, and, I'm going to tell you a semi-tasteless joke that I made. One year I was up for an Emmy Award for the writing of the Yada Yada episode of Seinfeld. And I was also up for an Emmy Award just because for Best Show, Seinfeld being the best show, because I was a producer. So I lost the writing award to the episode of Ellen when she, came out of the closet. And then I lost, the show lost to Frasier for Best Show. So I was talking to a reporter, and I happened to just make this joke where I said, I lost to Ellen for coming out of the closet, and I lost to Frasier for never coming out of the closet. And that night, I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be in so much trouble. But, I can't resist if the line's good enough, I can't resist it. And I was already at DreamWorks when that happened. So I was a little bit worried about that because, I wouldn't have worried if it was at Seinfeld because that's our humor. But then the next day, Jeffrey Katzenberg that was such a funny line. So I was okay. But, even that was in, 1997, which was still, a lot more of a lot safer time than it is now.
But you probably couldn't say that today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know. I think Arnie mentions this too, is, there's good and bad about political correctness. It's very good that we're all so sensitive to each other now, and that we realize that things we say could be offensive or hurtful to others. And yet, at the same time, it just gets to the point where it's, you got to have a sense of humor about yourself no matter what, to some degree. I mean, you can't just be sitting out there going, oh my God, he said something that hits home with me and that's horrible. I mean, political correctness is a very dicey and very, tricky issue. And it's a hard one to put the balance on because it has its upsides and it has its downsides, especially if you're a person who puts a big value on humor. Mm-hmm. Political correctness is, can really cramp your style.
Katie, do we have another question?
We do. Says, one of my first editors said the best political reporters are former sports writers. What do you think the nexus is between sports and politics?
That's a good question. I wouldn't have thought that. I would have thought that it was the other way around, that a really great, hard news reporter, if you wanted to go over to sports, would make a great sports writer because they're used to getting nitty-gritty information. I would think that, in my way of looking at it, if you're going from sports to news, it's almost like it could cramp your style, that you get so much more writing freedom in sports and then at news, you're supposed to basically, just give them the facts. That said, I think at newspapers, that happens a lot, that people go from sports to news because, at a place, especially so prestigious as the Washington Post or the New York Times, the sports section, you're not quite eating at the adult table. When you're reporting about the Redskins, you're not exactly, doing what, Ashley Parker is doing, or, You know, when you're writing about the hapless New York Knicks, you're not exactly doing what Peter Baker at the New York Times is doing, or Maggie Haberman, or any of those great reporters. Oh my God, here's the dog. Look at this. Ike. So, yeah, that's an interesting comment, though. I never heard that. That's really, I would have thought it's the other way around, but interesting.
Any others, Katie?
Not right now. I'll throw out a question. I'm a big sports fan myself. I'm curious, Peter, what your thoughts are on our current lack of sports right now, due to the virus, and you know, what you see going forward, you know, when things eventually resume.
Boy, you know, I think this is so unprecedented that it's absolutely impossible to predict what's going to go on. And once they even decide what goes on, we are living in a time of unbelievably unforeseeable consequences. You know, just who knows what's going to happen if they play baseball games and there has to be some kind of social distancing, or, you know, I mean, this could really change the way we live in a very deep way, especially for, you know, hopefully 1 or maybe 2 years tops. But, you know, it's a very strange time. And, you know, you turn on TV and, you know, poor ESPN is trying desperately to fill up all day, you know, with no games or anything like, and really nothing to report on Sports Center. There's nothing to, you know, I mean, the NFL draft last week was like the Super Bowl. People were so excited, you know, because it was something that was currently happening. You know, I don't really, I kind of, you know, miss baseball box scores and NBA box scores. And, you know, the NBA season was, you know, especially interesting if you happen to live in LA, because we have 2 great teams now. And, you know, this Michael Jordan documentary is through the roof because people are so dying for sports. You know, I would hope maybe people would read a book instead. I doubt it happened, but
They can read your book.
It can be your book. Well, it's really crushing to see, you know, when you're trying to run a university and you realize how much of the revenue and how much interest and how much, you know, without those sporting events. And a number of parents have said to me, I don't know if I want to send my child to school. I wanted them to have that college experience of going to games. And of course, kids tend to watch sporting events on their phones these days, not so much face to face, but I take the point. You know, it's an important cultural part of the college experience.
yes, I mean, but it's one of 20 important college experiences. I mean, you know, I would argue that just walking down the mall in the middle of a day is a more important college experience than, you know, shouting some kind of weird chant at the other team at, you know, at a basketball game. You know, again, I have that thing with sports where you know, when I was at Maryland, I used to joke that, you know, we had there were these machines all over campus. They were called Mackey machines, where they had food. And it was the first time I ever saw a microwave oven. God knows. I mean, I still expect that'll ultimately be the cause of my death. Well, one of those things I ate from those Mackey machines. But, you know, they had sodas and everything like that. And I was always joking that every quarter that you put in there was going directly to Cole Fieldhouse. You know, because because sports was, you know, such a big deal there.
Well, Peter, next time you come to campus, you'll be amazed to look out the window across from Knight Hall and see what Cole Fieldhouse has become. It will just.
I heard like a facility now, right? That for, you know, the training facility. Yeah.
It's the home of football and neuroscience and kinesiology, and it's enormous. It's absolutely enormous. Do we have another question, Katie?
We do. We have a couple more questions. First, we've got from Eileen Kessler asks, Peter, can you share a fond memory from the Diamondback? She says she worked on the copy desk during your time there and remembers you from way back when.
Oh my God, I remember her. That's so amazing. I have many fond memories. There was a guy, I don't know if you remember this, Eileen, there was a guy who I loved there, and I was really friendly with a reporter. His name was Bob Gordon. And he used to, while he was writing an article, when he'd think, he would always just look up and stare at somebody. So every time you'd look up in that office, he'd be like staring at me, like sometimes, and it was like terrifying. I remember just thinking like, boy, what a strange bunch of people here. And then once that they were talking about building a tennis center at the university, and somebody was covering that story for a long time. And then then I heard that the news was breaking that they decided, yes, we're going to build this tennis center. And the guy who had been covering that story was like away for the day or something like that. And I ended up getting the biggest story, you know, like the real front page lead on that one. And it wasn't even my story. And I was so excited. And then I was thinking, boy, maybe journalism like really the place for me. I'm pretty competitive about this, you know. But there was so many great experiences at the Diamondback. It was just, you know, I think when we were there, it won for the best student newspaper like 2 out of the 4 years nationally, the best student newspaper in the country.
And at least one of those years, the amazing editor Paula Ellis was your editor, right?
Yes, I love Paula. I'm friends with her on Facebook now. She was like I guess she was, you know, like a senior or a junior when I was a freshman. Yeah, Paula was great. And there was a lot of like newsroom dating going on, which was always exciting.
Peter, we have another question asking, oops, sorry, it just went off my screen. There we go. Do you have any anecdotes about how the book has been received by the general public so far?
You know, almost all of it's been very positive. I mean, you know, I think the only, you know, the one interesting aspect of it is that, you know, it's got a big sports aspect, and then it's got a big sexual politics aspect. And sometimes a reader is going to be either interested in one of those and not the other. You know, there are some sports fans who are not going to be at all who are going to love the sports stuff and not really be very interested in the sexual politics, and vice versa. But other than that, you know, everybody's said that it's incredibly funny and it's an incredibly fast read. And they can't put it down. They try to put it down, but they cannot put it down. I mean, they say they're sitting in that chair reading going, I really want to put this down, but no, I can't do it. I can't put it down.
Peter,
personally, I've never found a book I couldn't put down, but that's me.
Kathy asks, how did you make the transition from journalism to comedy?
By accident. When I was writing freelance magazine articles, I did write a lot of humor pieces. You know, when you're writing freelance, you know, you're trying to get published, you know, just to make a living, you have to get published as much as you can. So I was writing for a lot of women's magazines at Condé Nast because the first freelance article that I sold, I had gotten laid off from ABC Sports and I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next. And I wrote this piece, you know, I had kind of some free time, and I wrote this article called the "We Just Broke Up Last Night" diet. It's what you eat for the next 5 days after you've been dumped. And I sent it to somebody through a contact at Mademoiselle magazine, which no longer exists, and they published it and they loved it. And they wanted me to write more. So I was writing a lot of humor pieces from a male point of view for women's magazines. So I was doing some humor writing. And I wrote a humor piece, but that was rather bittersweet, that was published in the New York Times. And that was the article that I gave to Larry David and that he passed on, that he passed on to Jerry Seinfeld, that ultimately, got me a chance to write for the show. I had only met Larry David in New York 1 or 2 times, and then I bumped into him out here, and he said, I'm doing this little show with Jerry Seinfeld, maybe you could give me a writing sample. And, I want to stress, I bumped into him because no matter what, luck is really where it's at. Luck is a big, big, big part of life. And finding ways to maximize your chances of getting lucky, I think, is a big deal.
Peter, so one of our students, Ambi, asks, what do you think the future of comedy is?
Hi, Ambi. I know her from Twitter and Facebook. The future of comedy. Let me give you an optimistic outlook. Since it is basically impossible to shock anyone anymore, since no matter how perverse the sex jokes you make, we've already heard it. Nobody's going to be more, more outrageous than some of the crazy comics we have now. And then, you're going to I'm hoping that it goes in the direction of Sarah Silverman, where she doesn't do things just for shock value. She does it with such finesse, and it's so funny. I know this sounds like weird, but I'm hoping where it'll go is that there'll be more of an emphasis on humor, on really being funny, and less of an emphasis on just trying to shock people. Less of an emphasis on, I'm an attractive girl and I'm a comedian and I'm going to say the grossest possible thing. Or I'm a guy and, I'm going to say the most incredibly sexist thing you've ever heard, but, it's all in fun. And, that's just, I'm just hoping comedy actually goes in the direction of humor as opposed to shock. That's the optimistic point of view because, ultimately shock is going to wear off. It's already worn off for the most part. And, you can't really go much farther than Richard Pryor went or, and, with political correctness as it is, there's just so far you can go with race and religion and all the subjects that have been so important to comedy. So hopefully people will just focus on, be funny, be creative, tell interesting stories. One of the things that bugged me is that it seems like everybody in stand-up went to the same comedy school. They all talk about their own life, their own dating and stuff like that. And, yeah, it's nice to talk about your own life in a way, but wouldn't you rather be creative? that's one of my big bones. Not, you know, my bones of contention is that, you know, people are very averse to being creative. You know, they want to tell their own stories, like everybody's writing a memoir, you know, or when they write a novel, it's really very personal about their own life. You know, my feeling is if you're going to write a novel, you know what you should do? Make it up.
So Carrie Lynn has asked, Carrie's on. Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Carrie.
She wants to know, can you send us a link, or where can we find the article that launched your Seinfeld career? Do you know, is it available in the New York Times archive?
You know where it's available?
Huh.
It's available on petermehlman.com, my very cleverly entitled website, which has just been relaunched and with all new graphics and very exciting. And that article is on there because, you know, there's a thing with that lists that gives links to a whole bunch of different articles. And I thought that one should be on there because I do get a lot of requests for that one.
It's just like, you know what, we're gonna have to wind up shortly, but I see that George Solomon is on our chat. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Mr. Solomon or any funny stories you can share, because I know you go way, way back with George.
No, I have nothing but the fondest memories of George. I remember the very, very first article I wrote for him was about railbirds, these people who hang out on the rail at Laurel Raceway. And, you know, I got this assignment and I was so excited, and, you know, I wrote the piece and I handed it in, and I'm kind of expecting George to either, you know, like give me some critique or anything like that. And he just goes, great, $50. And that was it. I was thinking, boy, this is a tough business.
How long did you work at the Post before you moved to New York?
I was there 78, 79, 80.
Okay.
Yeah, I wrote a letter to George, a job letter when I had mononucleosis. So, you know, I wasn't really able to do much, so I just wrote letters.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for tonight's program. As Stuart, who's on the chat, is saying, this is very much needed relief at a very surreal time. And thanks for being such a generous participant and such an incredible supporter of Merrill College. Peter, it's always a treat to see you.
It's a complete privilege just to be involved with the school. I really, you know, it's the greatest place in the world. Well, and for you people who are there and still students there, you know, I hope you get back on campus and everything gets back to some degree of normalcy, and you know, you just get to cherish the experience, because that campus is heaven as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. We'll be coming back. Katie, do you have any other announcements?
I would just encourage everyone, our next program is coming up next week on May 6th at the same time. And we've got a panel of all Merrill College alumni who will be talking about media coverage of COVID-19 and their own experiences in reporting on the pandemic. That'll be moderated by Jay Kernis, who's a producer with CBS Sunday Morning. And the panelists will include Margaret Talev of Axios, former president of the White House Correspondents Association, Teddy Amenabar with the Washington Post, Alexa Lardieri with US News and World Report, and Jason Newman with WBAL in Baltimore. So I encourage everyone to join us for that next week.
Good night, everybody.
Everyone.
Take care, Peter.
Thank you. Take care, Lucy.